She was beaten, broken, and left to die. And every single person in town watched it happen and said nothing. A 23-year-old woman, a powerful man who believed money made him untouchable, and an entire town that chose to look the other way. This is the story of what happens when silence becomes a weapon, and what one man from the mountains decided to do about it. If this story moves you, hit that like button and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. Now sit back, because this one doesn't let go. Red Hollow wasn't the kind of town that appeared on maps anybody cared about. It sat wedged between two ridgelines in a valley that the railroad had almost reached 30 years ago before deciding the grade was too steep and the population too thin to bother. After that near miss, the town had settled into a particular kind of resignation. The way a man who almost made something of himself eventually stops talking about it. The buildings along the main street were mostly false-fronted, their second stories nothing but painted wood pretending to be something grander. The church steeple leaned 3 degrees to the east. Nobody had fixed it in 11 years, and by now, nobody noticed anymore. What Red Hollow did have was cattle, or more precisely, Red Hollow had the Calloway family, and the Calloway family had cattle, more head than any other operation within 200 miles. The Calloway brand, a double C burned into the flank, showed up on stock throughout the territory, and wherever that brand showed up, so did the Calloway name. It was printed on the deed to the feed store. It was printed on the note held against the livery stable. Mitchell Calloway, the patriarch, had quietly acquired enough paper in Red Hollow that refusing the family anything felt less like stubbornness and more like financial suicide. People understood this. People adapted. The sheriff, a barrel-chested man named Aldous Pruitt, had been elected 3 consecutive terms on the understanding that the Calloway ranch hands voted in a block, and that block went where Mitchell told it to go. Pruitt wasn't entirely corrupt in the way some men are. He didn't steal, didn't take bribes in cash, didn't shake down travelers passing through. He was corrupt in a quieter way, the way most people manage corruption. He simply knew which problems were worth his attention and which ones weren't. He had developed, over years of practice, an extraordinary ability to look directly at something and process it as nothing. The doctor, Emmett Fales, was a different category of problem altogether. He was a small man with precise hands and a fondness for imported bourbon that cost more than he earned from actual medicine. The Calloway family kept a running account with him, treatments for ranch hands, the occasional emergency when someone took a bad fall off a horse. It wasn't an explicit arrangement. It never needed to be explicit. Into this town, in the autumn of her 22nd year, Evelyn Hartwell had moved with $37, 2 trunks of clothing, and a letter of recommendation from her former employer 3 counties over. She had taken a room above the dry goods store run by a widow named Clara Statch, and found work as a seamstress, an occasional schoolroom aide. She was not remarkable in any way that Red Hollow would have understood. She was quiet and competent, and paid her rent on time. She kept to herself. That was the problem, as it turned out. Or rather, that was what Cade Calloway decided was the problem. Mitchell Calloway's only son was 28 years old, and had never been told no by anyone who mattered. This wasn't an accident of personality. It was the result of a deliberate architecture of deference that Mitchell had built around his son since boyhood, partly out of genuine love, and partly because Cade was the only thing Mitchell had produced that he considered worth protecting. The ranch would go to Cade. The accounts would go to Cade. The name would go to Cade. Everything Mitchell had ground out of this hard country over 40 years would transfer, upon his death, to a young man who had done almost none of the grinding. Cade knew this, and it made him simultaneously grateful and contemptuous. Grateful for the inheritance, contemptuous of the man who'd made it necessary by not dying faster. He was handsome in a way that had probably been charming at 17 and had since curdled into something harder. His jaw was strong, his shoulders wide, and he rode a black horse that cost more than most families in Red Hollow earned in a year. He had his father's eyes, a pale, calculating gray. But where Mitchell's eyes had learned patience, Cade's had only learned appetite. He had noticed Evelyn Hartwell in September, on a Thursday afternoon when she was carrying a bolt of fabric across the main street. He had watched her from horseback without announcing himself, the way a man watches something he's already decided to take. He had sent flowers the following week. She had accepted them politely. He had called at the dry goods store 2 Sundays later and asked if she would ride with him. She had declined, also politely. He had asked again. She had declined again, less politely. The third time, she hadn't answered the door at all. The thing about men like Cade Calloway is that rejection doesn't register as information. It registers as malfunction, a machine that isn't working the way it's supposed to. And when a machine malfunctions, you don't take no for an answer. You find the thing that's broken and you fix it, or you break it worse in the process. Nobody in Red Hollow would have told him any of this. So nobody did. Later, when Evelyn tried to reconstruct the night in her memory, she kept losing pieces of it. Not because she hadn't been present, she had been ferociously, horribly present, but because the brain does strange things with experiences it cannot organize into sense. She remembered leaving Clara Statch's dry goods store at dusk, a basket over one arm, heading toward the apothecary to pick up a tincture Clara had ordered for her joints. The street had been nearly empty. There was a cold snap moving in from the north and people were indoors. She remembered hearing hooves behind her, then stopping. She remembered Cade Calloway's voice. She remembered the specific quality of it, not loud, not angry, completely calm in a way that was worse than anger. He'd said something about how he'd been patient. He'd said something about how her behavior had been embarrassing for him, and he wanted her to understand something about what happened to people who embarrassed him. She didn't remember every word after that. Her mind had started compressing things, collapsing time. What she remembered clearly, the cold dirt under her palms. A sound she would later understand was one of her ribs cracking. Her basket overturned, the contents scattered across the road, the toe of a boot, the specific dark color of the sky above her, a shade of blue-black she would not be able to look at for a long time afterward without her hands starting to shake. He hadn't done it himself. He was too careful for that. He'd had 2 of his ranch hands with him, men who understood that their employment depended on their willingness to follow instructions without asking for explanations. When it was over, Cade had crouched beside her. She remembered that clearly. His face close to hers, his voice still that particular awful calm. "Nobody's going to believe you," he said, "and even if they did, nobody's going to do anything about it. You're going to figure that out. It'll be easier for you if you figure it out soon." He stood, brushed the dirt off one knee with a single fastidious gesture, and rode away. She lay in the road for 11 minutes before anyone helped her. She would learn that number later. She knew it was a long time because she counted, the way you count when there's nothing else to do. When the pain is so big, there's nothing in your mind except numbers and the sound of your own unsteady breathing. 3 people passed her on that road. She knew this because she could see their boots, different boots, 1 pair at a time. Each pair stopped. Each pair stood there for a moment. Each pair walked away. The 4th pair of boots belonged to Tom Hess, who ran the feed store and was, by Red Hollow's standards, one of its more decent citizens. He was a large, slow-moving man with a gray beard and a habit of doing small kindnesses, leaving a sack of grain for a family that was short, covering a tab at the hardware store without being asked. He crouched beside her. He looked at her face, at her arm, at the way she was holding her side. "Miss Hartwell." His voice was low, troubled. "Please," she said. She meant, "Please help me. Please call for someone. Please don't leave." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked down the road in the direction Cade Calloway and his men had gone. "I'll get you inside," he said finally. He helped her up. He walked her to the nearest building, which happened to be the barber shop, and he sat her in a chair inside and told the barber her name and said she'd had a fall. Then he left. A fall. She had not had a fall. The barber sent for Dr. Fales. Follies arrived in 15 minutes, his bag under his arm, slightly disheveled in the way of a man summoned from a comfortable chair rather than from sleep. He examined her with professional thoroughness. He was not cruel about it. He was simply very careful not to look at her face while he worked. A peculiar quality of avoidance she noticed even through the pain. "1 rib cracked, possibly 2, he said when he was done. "The shoulder is wrenched but not dislocated. The cuts on your hands will heal on their own. The bruising on your face—" He paused. "That will take some time." "I need to file a report," Evelyn said. Her voice came out rougher than she expected. "With the sheriff." Bales began repacking his bag. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he hadn't heard her. "Doctor, I heard you, Miss Hartwell. I need to tell him what happened. I need to tell him who—" "I know who." Bales said it quietly, still not looking at her. Anyone with eyes could figure out who. She stared at him. Then, I'm going to prescribe you something for the pain. He pulled out a small notebook and wrote without looking up. You should rest for at least 2 weeks. Light movement after that. The ribs need time. Are you going to help me? She asked. She hated that her voice cracked on the last word. She hated that she needed to ask. Fales tore the page from his notebook and set it on the arm of the chair. He picked up his bag. He stood. I have a family, he said. It wasn't an apology, and it wasn't an explanation. It was just a fact he was placing on the table between them, as if facts excused everything. He walked out. She sat in the barber's chair for a while after that, holding the prescription note in her hand, not reading it, just feeling the paper between her fingers because it was something solid to hold on to. She went to Pruitt the next morning. It took her an hour to get dressed because of the rib and the shoulder, and she had to stop twice on the walk to the sheriff's office because the pain spiked when she moved too fast. Pruitt was behind his desk when she came in. He looked at her face. The bruising was spectacular by morning, purple-yellow spreading from her cheekbone to her jaw. And something moved across his expression, something that might have been discomfort or might have been calculation. It was hard to tell the difference on his face. She sat down. She told him what had happened. She told him clearly, with the specific details she had retained. The road, the time, the voices, the boots, what Cade had said to her afterward. She spoke for almost 10 minutes without stopping. When she finished, Pruitt was quiet for a moment. Those are serious accusations, he said. They're not accusations. They're what happened. Miss Hartwell. He leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. I've known the Calloway family for 22 years. That's not relevant. What I'm saying is, this kind of allegation against a man of Cade Calloway's standing, his standing, she repeated. There would need to be evidence. There would need to be witnesses. There were witnesses, she said. 3 people walked past me in that road, and before anyone walked past, there were 2 men with Cade who could— ranch hands, Pruitt said. His employees. You understand the problem. She understood the problem exactly. She sat with it for a moment. So you're not going to do anything? He didn't answer. He straightened a paper on his desk with 2 fingers. Sheriff, she said, I am asking you. I will look into it, he said. The tone he used was the tone you use to end a conversation, not to begin an investigation. She stood. The movement hurt, and she couldn't keep it from showing on her face. Pruitt watched her. She thought she saw something in his eyes that might have been guilt. A faint, uncomfortable flicker. It wasn't enough. It wasn't close to enough. You know what happened, she said. You know who did it, and you're going to sit there. He said nothing. She walked out. The weeks that followed were a specific kind of suffering that Evelyn Hartwell was not equipped for, because nothing in her life had prepared her for it. She had been poor before. She had been lonely before. She had been frightened before, the ordinary fear of a woman alone in a world that didn't put a lot of resources into protecting women alone. She knew those feelings. She could navigate them. What she could not navigate was the silence. Not literal silence. Red Hollow was never literally silent. There were voices in the street, hammers against wood, horses and wind, and the sounds of a working town going about its business. What she meant by silence was the particular silence of being looked through by people who saw you clearly and chose not to. Clara Statch was kind to her, in the way Clara was kind to most things, practically, without much emotion. She brought soup. She didn't ask questions. She also didn't ask how Evelyn was feeling or what she intended to do, or whether she needed help finding a lawyer or a way to get word to the territorial authorities. Clara was kind in exactly the way that didn't cost anything. The Hendersons next door stopped greeting Evelyn in the morning. Not rudely. They just seemed to find reasons to be facing the other direction. The Reverend preached a sermon about forgiveness the Sunday after the incident that was, as far as Evelyn could determine, addressed directly at her. Tom Hess, who had been the one to help her inside, crossed to the other side of the street when he saw her. The bruising on her face began to yellow and fade. The rib, which she was supposed to rest, kept her in pain when she breathed too deeply. She developed a habit of shallow breathing that made her lightheaded sometimes, but it was better than the sharp catch of a full breath pressing against damaged bone. She wrote a letter to the territorial marshal's office. She didn't know if it would get there. She didn't know if anyone would read it. She sent it anyway, walking to the post office at a time she calculated Cade Calloway and his men were unlikely to be in town, dropping the sealed envelope through the slot with fingers that wouldn't stop shaking. Nothing came back. She wrote another letter, then another. She kept going. Cade Calloway heard that she had gone to the sheriff, and this annoyed him less than she would have hoped. What annoyed him more was that she hadn't left town. He had expected her to leave. Most people, when they understood the architecture of things in Red Hollow, either adapted or departed. He had fully anticipated that Evelyn Hartwell would depart. She would gather her trunks and her $37 and whatever else she'd accumulated, and she would find somewhere else to be, which was the reasonable and expected response to his message. She had not done this. Instead, she was still there, still moving around town, slowly and carefully, clearly in pain, but moving. And this violated his sense of how things were supposed to work. He said something about it to his father. Mitchell Calloway listened with his hands folded on his desk and his pale gray eyes doing that calculation they were always doing. He was 64, still physically formidable in the way of men who have worked their bodies hard for decades and haven't quite admitted they're slowing down. He had a face like sun-dried leather and a voice that had never needed to be raised to be heard. "Let it rest," Mitchell said when Cade finished. "She's still talking to people. Let it rest." Mitchell unfolded his hands and picked up a pen. "She's a seamstress with no family and no money, and nobody in this town is going to put themselves on the line for a seamstress with no family and no money. The problem resolves itself." "And if it doesn't?" Mitchell looked at him over the edge of his reading glasses. "Then we'll have a different conversation." This was how Calloway problems were handled, with patience, with distance, with the quiet confidence of men who had never had a problem that money didn't eventually solve. Cade left the conversation unsatisfied, which was a state he handled poorly. She'd always thought of herself as someone who could manage things. It was perhaps the defining quality of her character, a practical, almost stubborn competence. She managed her money carefully. She managed her work carefully. She managed the small crises of her life the way most competent women manage them, quietly, without waiting for someone to notice and offer help. Pain was different. Pain didn't respond to management the way other things did. It didn't care about her competence or her stubbornness or her meticulous letters to the territorial marshal. It was simply there, a fact, every morning when she woke up and tried to sit up and felt the rib announce itself. It was there when she tried to work and couldn't hold her needle steady because her shoulder still wasn't right. It was there at 2 a.m. when she lay on her back in the dark. She couldn't sleep on her side anymore, staring at the ceiling and trying to calculate what her options actually were. She had $43 now, counting what she'd managed to earn since the incident. Not enough to buy passage anywhere meaningful, not enough to rent somewhere new and survive while she found work. She thought about her parents, gone since she was 16. She thought about her aunt in Missouri, who had taken her in for a year after that, and then politely indicated that she was on her own now, that the aunt's husband wasn't comfortable with the arrangement. She had no one to go to, and she refused, stubbornly, maybe stupidly, but absolutely refused, to let that fact be what ended this. Some nights, lying in the dark, counting her breaths carefully to avoid the sharp edge of the rib, she let herself feel how frightened she was. She didn't fight it. She just lay there with the fear, let it be the size it actually was, let herself acknowledge that it was enormous and legitimate and deserved to be felt. And then, in the morning, she got up. That was the whole plan. She got up. Silas Crow came into Red Hollow on a Wednesday in early November, which meant almost nobody noticed him. Wednesday was not a day Red Hollow paid attention to. Things happened on Saturdays. The market, the saloon traffic, the occasional fist fight. Sundays had the church and its social rituals. The rest of the week was just the week's middle, unremarkable, a time for work and not much else. Crow came in from the North Road, down from the high country, with a mule loaded with pelts and a rifle across his saddle, and the look of a man who had been living primarily outdoors for most of the year. He was 36, lean in a way that had nothing to do with fashion and everything to do with a life that didn't offer second portions, with a face that had been weathered into something more texture than skin. He had dark eyes and a scar along his left jaw that he'd gotten from a cougar when he was 23. The cougar had come out worse than he had, which told you something about him. He was not, by appearance, a man you noticed right away. He didn't have the particular loudness that some men use as a social tool, announcing themselves in a room. He came in quiet and stayed quiet and seemed perfectly comfortable in his own skin without needing anyone else to verify the fact. He did his business at the trading post, got a fair price on the pelts, and better than fair on 2 specimens he'd taken at high altitude that the trader hadn't seen before. He ate a meal at the saloon, not drinking, just eating, which the bartender noted privately was unusual for men who came down from the mountains. And he took a room at the boarding house run by a man named Garrett, who was, by Red Hollow standards, one of the town's more neutral presences. Not beholden to the Callaways, not wealthy enough to be worth cultivating. He planned to stay 3 days, maybe 4. He needed to pick up supplies, get the mule reshod, and rest in a bed before going back up. He hadn't planned to notice Evelyn Hartwell. He hadn't planned to notice anything beyond what he needed to notice to get his business done. But Crow had spent 15 years in wilderness that killed inattentive men, and attention had become something he did automatically, a reflex like breathing. He noticed things. That was simply what he did. He saw her first on Thursday morning. She was coming out of the dry goods store with a wrapped parcel under her good arm. He clocked immediately that she favored her right side, that the way she moved suggested something structural was wrong, not a new injury, but not old enough to have settled into the body's accommodations. The bruising on her face had faded to the yellow-green stage that meant roughly 3 weeks old, maybe a little less. She walked carefully, choosing her steps, not because of the terrain, but because each step had a cost she was calculating. He had seen that walk before, not on a woman specifically, on a trapper named Kestwick who'd taken a bad beating from a rival 3 seasons back. The measured quality of the movement, the hypervigilance in the eyes, always checking approaches, always tracking who was near. He didn't think much of it, beyond noticing it. Red Hollow's business wasn't his business. He had come for supplies, not stories. What made him stop and actually pay attention was something else. The street. Specifically, it was the way other people in the street related to her. He had a good eye for social geometry, the way bodies in a space orient toward each other, the invisible lines of acknowledgement and avoidance that structure human movement in public places. You learned to read it in the wilderness, where the geometry was simpler but the stakes were total. Every creature in a landscape was positioned in relation to every other creature, predator and prey and observer. Red Hollow's main street on that Thursday morning was showing him something he recognized. She was the center of a pattern of avoidance. It wasn't obvious. You'd miss it if you weren't paying a specific kind of attention, but there it was. The man who glanced at her and then glanced away with a fractional acceleration that wasn't about disinterest but about discomfort. The woman who smiled at her too quickly, too briefly, and then moved on with the particular efficiency of someone who doesn't want to be seen standing near a certain person. The overall effect of bodies subtly, consistently failing to be in the same space as Evelyn Hartwell. Crow stopped outside the hardware store and watched for a while. Then he watched her face while she navigated it, the way she'd learned to keep her expression neutral, to pretend she didn't see what she was seeing. The effort it took, the way her jaw was set. He thought, somebody did something to this woman, and this whole town is pretending they don't know. He thought, that's none of my concern. He went into the hardware store and bought the nails he needed, but he kept thinking about it. That was the problem with noticing things. You couldn't always choose when to stop. It was Garrett, the boarding house owner, who gave him the shape of it, not intentionally. Garrett was not a man who gossiped, exactly, but he was a man who, given a glass of something in the evening and a quiet listener, talked about his town the way people who have lived somewhere long enough talk about it, with the exhausted familiarity of someone who has accepted everything and is mildly amazed by nothing. Crow was a good listener. It was another thing wilderness had taught him. You listen to the country, the birds, the wind in the trees, the particular quality of a stream's sound, and the country told you things. People weren't so different. If you kept quiet and didn't interrupt, they told you things too. He didn't ask about Evelyn Hartwell specifically. He didn't have to. He just let Garrett talk, and eventually the shape of Red Hollow emerged. The Callaway family and their land and their particular kind of gravity, the way everything in town orbited that center whether it wanted to or not. And somewhere in the middle of that, almost as an aside, Garrett mentioned that there'd been trouble with a girl, a newcomer, nobody's daughter or sister or wife, a phrase that revealed more about how the town thought than Garrett probably intended, and that the Calloway boy had been involved and that nothing had come of it. Nothing came of it, Crow said. Nothing ever does, where that family's concerned. The girl still in town? Garrett gave him a look. Still here. Don't know why she stays, honestly. Crow thought he knew why she stayed. He'd met people like her before. Not many, but enough. People with a particular kind of refusal in them that looked like stubbornness from the outside but was really something else. Something closer to the instinct that keeps an animal fighting when it should logically stop. Pure, irrational insistence on existing. He admired it in an abstract way. He went to bed. He lay awake for a while, doing the mental argument he recognized, the one he'd had with himself before on different terrain about different situations. You can't fix everything. You're not here to fix things. Get your supplies, get your mule shod. Go back up where you can breathe. He was still awake an hour later. He told himself he was just curious. He spent Friday moving around town with the particular unhurried quality of a man who has nowhere specific to be. And he asked questions the way careful people ask questions. Obliquely, in the context of other conversations, attached to things that seem more innocuous. He talked to the blacksmith, who was shoeing the mule and was the kind of man who liked talking while he worked. He talked to a woman at the market stall who sold dried goods and had opinions about everyone. He bought a beer at the saloon and sat at the bar and listened to what moved around him. By the end of Friday, he had most of the outline. He had the date, October 14th. He had the location, the main road, just past the barber shop. He had the names of 2 ranch hands who were seen with Cade Calloway that evening, hands named Decker and Muir, who had since been reassigned to a remote section of the Calloway land, which was either coincidence or wasn't. He also had something nobody had mentioned to Evelyn, because nobody had bothered to mention it. A man named Ord Yates, who drove the freight wagon and had been coming in from the eastern approach that evening, had seen 3 horses tied outside the alley between the barber shop and the milliner. He'd noted the horses without assigning significance and had driven past. He'd mentioned it to his wife. His wife had mentioned it to her sister. Crow had encountered the sister at the market stall. Tied horses. 3 of them. In an alley. At dusk. He went and looked at the alley on Saturday morning. It was just an alley. Dirt, shadows, a broken barrel. But the ground near the barbershop wall still held the impression of boots in a patch of softer earth that hadn't fully dried. Multiple sets, the scuff pattern of someone dragged or falling. He crouched and looked for a while without touching anything. He was not a detective. He was a wilderness guide. But in the wilderness, you read the ground for story. What passed here? How many? How fast? Where it went? The story written in this patch of earth was ugly and clear. He stood and looked at the pattern of boot impressions for another moment. Then he found Evelyn Hartwell. She was at the pump at the edge of the square, filling a bucket. He walked over with no particular pretense of having other business in that direction. "Miss Hartwell?" She turned with the reflex of someone who had learned to track approaching voices, and her eyes assessed him quickly. Threat or no threat? The calculation happening in the space of a second. "I don't know you," she said. "No." He stopped a few feet away, which was deliberate. "Name's Crow. Silas Crow. I'm staying at Garrett's place." "What do you want?" He appreciated the directness. A lot of people wrapped that question in enough pleasantries that you couldn't find the actual question inside. "I want to know what happened to you, Aunt," he said. "And I want you to know I've been asking around and I think I have most of the shape of it already." Something moved through her expression, a complicated thing, part wariness and part something she was trying not to let be hope, because hope had been a problem for her lately. "You a lawman?" she asked. "No." "Then why does it matter to you?" He thought about it. He wasn't someone who answered questions reflexively. He tended to actually think about what the true answer was before he gave it. "It bothers me when I see something wrong and everyone around it is pretending it's not wrong," he said. "Makes a kind of noise in my head I have trouble stopping." She looked at him for a long moment. Her hands were still on the pump handle. The bucket wasn't quite full. "You're going to do what everyone else has done," she said. "Listen and then walk away. You have your business here and then you'll go back to wherever you came from." "Maybe," he said. "I haven't decided yet." "Then you should decide before you take up more of my time." She pumped the last of the water she needed and picked up the bucket and walked away. She walked carefully, the bucket adding a specific angle to how she held her body, and he watched her go and thought that the rib was worse than she was letting on. He stood there for a moment after she'd gone. Make a decision, he told himself. He made one. He went back to the alley that afternoon with a different purpose. What he was looking for was something Evelyn could use. Not the kind of evidence a tracker reads in the ground, but the kind a person could carry. He spent an hour going through the space methodically. He found the basket. It had been shoved behind the broken barrel, kicked or thrown there, partially under a rotted board. It was wicker, ordinary, the kind Clara Statch sold in her dry goods store. And still caught in the weave of it, slightly muddy, was a button. Not a common button. It was silver, engraved with a double C pattern, the Callaway brand. His jaw tightened. He wrapped it in a piece of cloth and put it in his coat pocket. He also found, in the dried mud near the far wall, the clear impression of a boot, large, distinctive, with a repair to the heel that had been done unevenly, leaving a pattern in the print that was legible as a specific individual boot. He made a careful sketch of the boot print in a small notebook he carried. Then he went to find Evelyn Hartwell again. He needed to show her what he'd found. He needed to tell her what he was thinking, because what he was thinking had stopped being something he could argue himself out of. What he was thinking was that this woman was going to keep deteriorating in this town, physically, because she was clearly not getting proper rest or proper treatment for an injury that was more serious than she was admitting, and otherwise, in all the ways a person deteriorates when they're surrounded by a community that has collectively chosen not to see them. And what he was thinking underneath that was something simpler and less analytical, that it was wrong. That it was wrong in a way that settled in him like a stone, immovable, and that he was not someone who could carry that kind of weight indefinitely without doing something about it. He found her at Garrett's boarding house, of all places. She had come to drop off a repaired jacket for Garrett's wife, and she was just leaving when he came through the front door. They stood in the entrance for a moment, face to face, the lowering afternoon light through the window falling between them. He pulled the cloth from his pocket and unfolded it and held it out to her. She looked at the button. She looked at him. Her face went through something. Recognition, confirmation, the particular complicated feeling of having known something and finally seen it made visible. "Where did you find that?" she asked. "The alley, behind the barrel." She was quiet for a moment. "That doesn't prove anything," she said. "They'll say it fell off. They'll say it was there before." "I know," he said. "It's not enough by itself, but it's the start of something." She looked at him. Her eyes, brown, very steady, and containing a kind of exhaustion he recognized from people who have been fighting on their own for too long, held his. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again. Not dismissively the way she'd asked before. Genuinely. "Because I was paying attention," he said, "and because it's the right thing." She was quiet for another long moment. The boarding house was warm around them, the sound of Garrett somewhere further back in the building, the ordinary sounds of a town going about its evening outside. "I've been here 2 months," she said quietly. "You've been here 3 days." "I know. And you're the first person who's—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. Something in her face tightened and then deliberately released. "You need to heal," he said. "Properly. That rib hasn't been treated right. If you stay here and keep moving around on it, you're going to be in trouble. I can't exactly go anywhere." "You can," he said, "if you trust me." She looked at him for a long time after that, not with suspicion exactly, more with the careful assessment of a woman who has learned the hard way that trust is a resource that gets spent and doesn't always replenish. "I don't know you," she said again, but the tone was different this time. It wasn't a refusal. It was a statement about where they were starting from. "No," he said, "but you will." Outside, the wind had picked up, coming down cold from the northern ridgeline where the high peaks sat in the early dark. He had said 3 days, maybe 4. He had a mule and a mountain and a winter schedule. He had made his decision in the alley, looking at a button with a double C stamp, and now it sat in him the way decisions sit when you've stopped arguing with them. Evelyn Hartwell had been left in a road. The town that found her had decided to pretend it hadn't happened, and Silas Crow, who had arrived from the mountains with pelts and a shopping list and absolutely no intention of getting involved in anyone's problems, had looked at the pattern of avoidance on a Thursday morning street and made the mistake of understanding exactly what it meant. Now here they were. "Come to dinner," he said, "at Garrett's table, somewhere with people, so you don't have to decide anything based on trusting me yet." She thought about it. "All right," she said finally. Outside, the wind pushed hard against the boarding house windows, rattling the panes in their frames. Somewhere above the ridgeline, in the high country where the air was thin and the stars were brutal and clear, the weather was already changing. And in Red Hollow, in the yellow light of a boarding house entrance, two people who didn't know each other yet stood at the beginning of something that neither of them had planned. Dinner at Garrett's table was not a comfortable affair. Garrett's wife, May, was a small woman with quick eyes who set a good table and asked no unnecessary questions, which Crow appreciated more than he could easily express. There were four of them: Garrett, May, Crow, and Evelyn. And the conversation moved around the edges of things the way conversation does when everyone at the table knows there's a subject that isn't being named. May talked about the weather coming in from the north. Garrett talked about the freight schedule and how it had been disrupted by early snow on the upper passes. Crow ate his food and contributed enough words to keep the conversation from going quiet in a way that would make Evelyn uncomfortable. He watched her from the corner of his eye without being obvious about it. She ate carefully, using her right arm as little as possible. She'd gotten better at hiding it, the small compensations, the adjusted angles. But he'd been watching injured things move through terrain his whole adult life, and he could see the architecture of it clearly. The rib was a constant, and there was something with her left hand, a stiffness in the knuckle of the middle finger that suggested it had been wrenched or struck and hadn't been properly set. After dinner, when Garrett and May had moved to the sitting room, Crow and Evelyn stayed at the table with the last of the coffee going cold between them. "You didn't eat much," he said. "I ate enough." She turned her cup in her hands. "You were watching me." "Habit. Uncomfortable habit." "Yes," he said. "I know." She was quiet for a moment, then, "The finger. I know you noticed that too. It happened at the same time. I haven't been able to hold a needle right since." She said it flatly, not asking for sympathy, just stating a fact. But underneath the flatness was something, a particular quality of contained anger that he recognized as the emotion of someone who has decided not to feel something until they have space to feel it safely. "Can you hold a pen?" he asked. She looked at him. "Why?" "Because I need you to write down everything you remember, every detail, in order, with dates and times where you have them. The conversations with the doctor and the sheriff, word for word as close as you can get." He put his notebook on the table between them. "Not for me. For the marshal's office, if we can get it to them in a form that makes someone pay attention. I already wrote letters." "I know. But a letter from a woman with no family and no standing in a town that's going to deny everything. That's one kind of document, a formal testimony with corroborating details, cross-referenced with physical evidence and a witness account from a third party." He paused. "That's a different kind of document." She studied him. "You've done this before." "Not exactly this," he said honestly. "But I've written reports for territorial agencies on illegal trapping operations that were backed by money and politics, and I know what makes a document something people act on versus something they file away." She pulled the notebook toward her slowly, opened it, looked at the blank pages. "I want to be clear about something," she said without looking up. "All right, I'm not helpless. I know how this looks, what's been happening, but I haven't been sitting in my room crying. I've been trying to find a way through this. The letters were my idea. Going to the sheriff was my idea. I know neither of them worked, but I want you to understand that I've been—" "I know," he said. She looked up. "I can see that you've been fighting," he said. "That's not in question." Something in her jaw loosened, fractionally. She looked back down at the notebook. "All right," she said. She picked up the pen and started writing. He let her write without hovering, moving to the other side of the table to give her space, occasionally refilling the coffee when it got cold. She wrote for almost an hour. He used the time to work on his own notes, the boot print sketch, the details he'd gathered from his conversations around town, the timeline as he understood it. When she finished, she pushed the notebook back to him. He read it straight through without commenting. It was meticulous. The detail was remarkable, but not just the events, but the texture of them, the specific quality of the silences, the exact words Fales had used, the angle of Pruitt's avoidance. She had a writer's memory for how things had felt, and she disciplined that into something clinical and usable. "This is good," he said. "Don't sound surprised." "I'm not surprised. I'm impressed. Those are different things." She looked at him for a moment, and something happened in her expression that he didn't try to name. It was too early for naming things. There were too many other problems in the way. "I'm going to ride out tomorrow," he said, "to the eastern approach where the freight driver said he saw those horses tied. I want to see if there's anything left after 3 weeks that corroborates the timeline." And then, he was honest with her, "Then I'm going to think about what the realistic options are, and I'm going to tell you what I think, and you can decide what you want to do." "What are the options you're already thinking about?" He was quiet for a moment. "The one that worries me," he said carefully, "is that you stay in this town while we try to build a case, and Cade Calloway decides he's waited long enough." She was very still. "He said something to you that night," Crow said. "You wrote it down, about how nobody would believe you. That's a man telling you to leave, and you didn't leave, which means that by now he's probably annoyed, and annoyed men with power make worse decisions than they would otherwise. You're saying I'm in danger. I'm saying I don't know yet, and I don't want to tell you that you're in danger just to make you frightened, but I want you to be thinking about it." She was quiet. Outside the window, the wind had picked up from the morning's pace, pushing hard against the glass. It had the sound of early winter behind it, that particular emptiness. "I've been frightened for 6 weeks," she said. "You're not introducing a new feeling." "I know that too," he said. She stood and gathered her coat from the back of the chair, a movement she managed smoothly enough that someone not paying attention wouldn't have seen the rib in it. "Thank you for dinner," she said. "Or for arranging it, I suppose." "You're welcome." She paused at the door, didn't turn around. "Crow," she said. "Yeah. If you decide tomorrow that this isn't worth the trouble, if you decide the evidence isn't there, or the risk is too much, or you just want to go back to the mountains," a pause. "I need you to tell me directly, not just disappear." He understood what she was asking. It wasn't about him specifically. It was about the accumulated experience of people who had said variations of "I'll help" and then quietly found reasons not to. "I'll tell you directly," he said. She left. He sat at the table for a while after, listening to the wind. The next morning, he rode out early. The eastern approach was a long graded road that bent around the base of a limestone outcrop before straightening toward town. Ord Yates, the freight driver, had been coming from the east, meaning he'd have had the alley on his left as he came in, the tied horses visible against the building wall at a distance of roughly 40 yards in fading evening light. 40 yards was close enough. Crow dismounted at the section of road Yates would have been on and walked it slowly, looking at angles and sight lines. The alley was visible from here clearly. No question that a man paying ordinary attention would have seen 3 horses tied at that wall. What he found that he hadn't expected was the ground on the road itself. The soil here was different, a harder clay composition that held impressions longer than the softer dirt in the alley. There had been traffic through here in the weeks since the incident, but at the road's edge, away from the main track, the clay held. 2 boot prints, side by side, pointed toward the alley. The stance of someone who had stood here for a minute, possibly 2, waiting, watching, checking the street before moving. And one of them had that distinctive uneven heel repair. He crouched and looked for a long time. Then he made a second, more careful sketch. He had now the same individual boot in 2 locations. The alley where Evelyn had been hurt, and this spot on the road that established a witness positioning. It wasn't a courtroom conviction, he knew that, but it was a thread that connected geography to a specific person in a way that was harder to dismiss than a woman's word against a rich man's denial. He rode back to town with the kind of focus that settles in when a problem that seemed complex starts to reveal its actual shape. He found Evelyn at Clara's dry goods store and told her what he'd found. She listened without interrupting, her face careful and controlled. And when he finished, she said, "Decker, Muir. Those are the 2 names people keep saying. Decker's the bigger man, probably. The boot is a size 12 at least. And they're out on the far range now. Which means the Calloways know those boots matter," Crow said. She absorbed that. "So what do we do with this?" "There's a federal land office in Harrow," he said. 2 days' ride northwest. They have a telegraph line to the territorial marshal. A physical deposition, hand-delivered, with the button and the boot sketches attached. That's different from a letter that gets sorted by a clerk. 2 days' ride, she said. I can't ride 2 days. He had expected this. I can take it, he said, if you sign the deposition. Your testimony signed and dated with my witness corroboration attached. She thought about it. He could see her working through the variables, what it meant for him to leave, what it left her with, what the risk calculation looked like from her side. And while you're gone, she said, keep close to Clara's. Don't go out at night. Stick to places where there are people around. You're trying to give me instructions, she said. There was a slight edge to it, not hostile, just noting. I'm trying to give you information that I think is relevant to your safety, he said. What you do with it is your choice. A pause. The edge softened. How long? She asked. 4 days total if the road's clear and I don't have trouble at the land office. Maybe 5 if the snows come down on the upper section. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the counter in front of her. There was a fabric bolt there that she'd been apparently considering when he came in. A practical dark blue wool, the kind of thing you bought for durability rather than beauty. Her hand rested on it without quite gripping. I haven't had anyone to rely on in a long time, she said. I'm not good at it. I know, he said. For what it's worth, I'm not particularly good at being relied on either. Ask anyone who's tried to hire me for more than one season. Something happened at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile's. More like the ghost of one, the suggestion that a smile existed somewhere in the vicinity. That's not reassuring, she said. I know that too, he said. She looked at him for a moment more. Then she said, All right, get the deposition written. I'll sign it. He spent that afternoon writing the formal document. Evelyn's account integrated with his corroboration, the button described and cataloged as evidence, the boot print sketches attached on separate pages with measurements included. He had not attended law school and did not pretend to know proper legal formatting, but he had written enough formal reports for enough territorial agencies that he knew what made a document look like it deserved attention versus what made it look like a complaint. When he brought it to Evelyn that evening, she read it twice, slowly. She made 2 corrections to the timeline, minor things, a time that was closer to 7 than 6, a detail about which direction she'd been walking. She was precise about it. She signed it. She held the pen in that stiff left hand and made herself sign her full name, and he watched the controlled effort it took and said nothing about it. He left before first light the next morning. The road to Harrow was 2 days of hard riding in the kind of weather that had clearly decided winter wasn't waiting for an invitation. The first day was cold and clear, and the miles came easily. The second day brought cloud cover that lowered itself onto the ridgeline by mid-morning and started putting down light, granular snow by afternoon. Not a storm, just the mountains reminding you they were there. He reached Harrow on the evening of the second day with his coat stiff and the mule deeply unhappy. The federal land office was, as government offices tended to be, closed when he arrived and run by a man who was clearly hoping to close it again as soon as possible when Crow showed up at opening time the next morning. The man, Holt was his name, mid-50s, with the look of someone who'd been sent to this posting as a mild punishment, listened to Crow's account with the special patience of a bureaucrat hearing something complicated that he wasn't sure was his problem. This is a territorial matter, Holt said, turning the deposition over in his hands. The marshal's jurisdiction, there's a federal component, Crow said. The victim has written to the marshal's office 3 times with no response. The local law enforcement is compromised. The family involved has land holdings that cross the territorial boundary into federal jurisdiction. He had prepared for this. What I'm asking for is a telegraph to the marshal's office transmitting the core details and a confirmation that this document has been received and registered by a federal office. Not an investigation, registration. Holt looked at him. He looked at the deposition again. He looked at the button, which Crow had brought in a small cloth bag. Registration, Holt repeated. So that if something happens to the woman in Red Hollow while this is pending, there's already a federal record establishing that her situation was known and reported. Holt was quiet for a moment. He was not, Crow judged, a bad man. He was a tired man with limited appetite for risk. But he was also smart enough to understand what Crow had just implied. That if he sent this telegram and registered this document and something happened to Evelyn Hartwell, he'd have done the right thing. And if he didn't and something happened, he'd have a different set of problems. I'll register it, Holt said, and I'll send the telegram today. I appreciate that, Crow said. He rode back to Red Hollow in 3 days instead of 4, pushing harder than was strictly kind to the mule, who registered its objection in the way mules do, methodically and without any particular urgency. He arrived on a Wednesday evening, 6 days after he'd left. He went directly to Clara's dry goods store. Clara Statch told him Evelyn wasn't there, and something in Clara's face, a tightness she was managing, the over-controlled quality of a woman who had something to say and wasn't sure she should, told him before she said anything else that something had happened. "Where is she?" he asked. "She's at the boarding house," Clara said. She had some trouble 2 days after you left. Nothing physical," she added quickly, reading his expression. "Nothing like before, but Cade Calloway came to the store personally, stood outside on the road and just stood there. For an hour. Didn't say anything, just stood there looking at the building." Crow felt something go cold and sharp in his chest. "She stayed inside," Clara continued, "but she wasn't good after. She's been at Garrett's since then. May has been with her." He went to the boarding house. Evelyn was in the small sitting room off the main hallway, a cup of tea on the table beside her that she'd apparently stopped drinking. She looked up when he came in, and something happened in her face, not quite relief, more like the particular feeling of a person who has been holding something alone for 6 days and has just been handed someone to share the weight with. She looked worse than when he'd left. Not physically. The rib and the shoulder were probably marginally better, but there were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there before, and a quality of exhaustion that had less to do with sleep and more to do with 6 days of being frightened without anywhere to put it. "You came back," she said. "I told you I would." She looked at him for a moment. "How did it go?" He told her about Holt, about the registration, about the telegraph. He told her that there was now a federal record that existed independently of Red Hollow, that her situation was documented somewhere that the Calloway family's money couldn't reach. She listened to all of it and then was quiet for a moment. "Clara told you about Cade," she said. "Yes." "He didn't do anything. He just stood there." "I know. But he wanted me to know he knew you'd gone, that I was alone." Crow sat down in the chair across from her. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and thought about what he was about to say and how to say it honestly without it sounding like he was making a decision for her. "Evelyn," he said, "I need to tell you what I think, and you need to hear all of it before you respond." She straightened slightly, wary but listening. "This document helps," he said. "The federal registration buys time and creates accountability, but it doesn't fix the immediate problem, which is that you're in a town where the only person willing to act on your behalf is me. And I'm not law enforcement, and I can't be here all day every day." "I know that," she said. "Calloway standing in the street for an hour is a message. It means he's past waiting for you to leave on your own. It means he's thinking about next steps." She was very still. "I want to take you out of this town," he said. "Up to the high country, where I have a cabin on land I know. Not permanently, yet just until the federal response comes and there are people here with actual authority. The territorial marshal's office can't ignore a registered complaint with a physical evidence log. They'll send someone. But that could take weeks, and you can't stay here for weeks with him escalating." She said nothing for a moment. He let the silence sit. "I'd be going into the mountains with a man I've known for 9 days, she said. "Yes. That's an insane thing to do." "In ordinary circumstances, absolutely," he said. "These aren't ordinary circumstances." "What's your cabin like?" The question surprised him. He hadn't expected her to move to logistics that quickly. "Small," he said honestly. "One room, but solid, built for hard winters. There's a second sleeping area in the loft. It's not comfortable." "I haven't been comfortable in 6 weeks," she said flatly. "Fair point." She looked down at her tea, cold by now. She turned the cup in her hands the way she had at Garrett's table that first night, and he was beginning to understand that this was something she did when she was thinking hard. "If I go," she said slowly, "I need to take my things, my work materials. If I'm going to be somewhere for weeks, I need to be able to work, or I'll lose my mind." "We can take what the horse can carry." She thought about it more. He watched her face move through the calculation. Not the emotional side of it, she was keeping that behind a wall, but the practical side. The actual yes or no. The federal office, she said. They'll know to look here for the response? Holt has the address. He'll route any communication through the land office and then to Garrett's, which is the return address I gave. And if I'm not here when it comes, Garrett knows to hold it. I spoke to him the morning I left. He had anticipated this. She looked at him. The steadiness in her eyes was the thing he kept coming back to. Not the fear, which was real and present, but the steadiness underneath it. The part of her that hadn't broken. You planned this before you left, she said. I planned for the possibility. You were fairly confident I'd still be here when you got back. I was hoping, he said, which was true. He had thought about it on the road, the possibility that he'd come back and she'd be gone, fled, or worse, and the thought had sat unpleasantly in him for most of the second day's riding. She was quiet for one more long moment. All right, she said. He nodded. Tomorrow morning, she said, early, before the town's awake. Before first light, he said. I'll have the horses ready. She stood, and this time when the rib caught her, she didn't quite manage to hide it. He saw it, and she saw him see it, and neither of them said anything about it. Crow, she said. Yeah. I want to be clear about something else. She met his eyes directly. I'm coming with you because it's the logical thing, and because I believe you when you say the danger is real, not because I need someone to protect me. I know that, he said. Good. She picked up her cold tea and walked toward the door, paused. Get some sleep. You look terrible. I've been riding for 3 days in November. I know. You still look terrible. She left. He sat in the empty sitting room for a while after, listening to the wind push against the boarding house and the occasional sound of the town settling into its night. Red Hollow. At 10 o'clock was a quiet place. The saloon still had a low murmur of life, but the respectable streets were dark and still. Somewhere out there, Cade Calloway was on his ranch, probably in a well-heated room, probably not thinking too hard about consequences, the way men who've never really faced them tend not to. Crow thought about the cabin, the small space of it, the wood stove that took 20 minutes to warm the room properly in November, the silence of the high country that was a completely different quality of silence than the silence of this town. He thought about the road up, which would be hard this late in the season, and about the mule who was going to be even more unhappy than usual about the extra weight. He thought about Evelyn Hartwell, who had stayed in this town for 6 weeks on pure stubbornness, and written letters that nobody answered and walked carefully through streets that pretended she wasn't there, and who had looked at him 9 days ago with eyes that contained exhaustion and defiance in equal measure, and said, "You're going to do what everyone else has done." He hadn't. Before first light, they would ride north. They left Red Hollow at 4 in the morning, when the town was as close to fully asleep as it ever got. Crow had the horses ready in the alley behind Garrett's stable, his own gray gelding and a borrowed roan mare that Garrett had agreed to loan without asking for an explanation, which was the kind of man Garrett was when it mattered. Evelyn came down the back stairs with 2 bags and her sewing case, moving quietly in the dark. She had dressed practically, heavy wool coat, boots with good soles, her hair pulled back and pinned. No vanity in it, no ceremony. Just a woman who understood that where they were going required different things than where she'd been. She handed him one of the bags without being asked, and he tied it to the roan's saddle without comment. They didn't speak until they were clear of town, a quarter-mile out on the north road with Red Hollow's false-fronted buildings shrinking behind them in the pre-dawn dark. "Cold," she said. "Gets colder," he said, encouraging. The first hour of riding was the hardest for her. He could tell by the way she held herself in the saddle, the particular rigidity of someone managing pain with concentration rather than comfort. The roan had a smooth gait, and he'd chosen her for that reason, but even a smooth gait means movement, and movement meant the rib made itself known with every stride. She didn't say anything about it. He didn't ask. By the time the sky began to gray at the edges, they were into the first real elevation gain, the road curving upward along the eastern face of the ridge, pine forest closing in on both sides, the air thinning just enough to notice. The town was gone from sight. The sound of it was gone too, which was a different kind of relief. The way removing a low, constant sound you've stopped consciously hearing still changes the quality of silence when it stops. Evelyn exhaled. He heard it, long and slow and deliberate. "Better?" he asked. Don't make it into something, she said. I'm not. She rode for a moment. Yes, she said. Better. They made camp that first night in a hollow below the tree line, sheltered on three sides by rock and heavy timber. Crow built the fire efficiently and without drama. No wasted motion, no fumbling. He'd built 10,000 fires in conditions worse than this, and it showed. Evelyn watched him work and then moved to help before he'd asked, gathering smaller wood to feed the growing flames, doing it one-handed where the shoulder required, but doing it. He made coffee and heated the food he'd packed, nothing elegant, dried meat and hard biscuit and beans cooked in a small pan. And they ate sitting close to the fire because the temperature had dropped hard once the sun went behind the peaks. Tell me about the cabin, she said. I told you, small. You said one room and a loft. Tell me the rest. He thought about it. Built it 4 years ago. Took most of a summer. It's about a mile above the tree line on the south-facing slope, which means it gets sun most of the day in winter, which matters more than people realize. Wood stove runs hot. There's a spring 50 yards east that runs clean year-round unless the cold is brutal. He paused. It's quiet. What kind of quiet? Wind and animal quiet, not the kind this town has. She understood the distinction. He could see it in her face. Red Hollow's silence was the silence of people withholding, an active, effortful thing, full of the pressure of everything unsaid. The mountain's silence was the silence of indifference. The mountains didn't care about her one way or the other, and there was something almost restful in that. How far? She asked. Tomorrow afternoon, if the upper pass is clear. It wasn't fully clear. The pass held a foot of snow that had come down in the week he'd been away, and they had to pick their way through it carefully. The horses unhappy and deliberate, the mule trailing behind on a lead and communicating its unhappiness in the mule's particular way, which involved a specific set of sounds and a general slowdown of all operations. But by mid-afternoon of the second day, the cabin was in front of them. It was smaller than she'd imagined and larger than he'd implied. The description of one room hadn't accounted for the depth of the space, the low loft accessible by a ladder, the stone hearth that took up most of one wall. It was rough in the way of buildings made by one person working alone. The joints were solid but not beautiful, the window frames slightly uneven, the door that needed a specific upward pressure to latch properly. It smelled like pine resin and cold ash and something else she couldn't name. The particular smell of a space lived in alone for long stretches. He had the stove going in 20 minutes. She sat on the low bench near the hearth and let the warmth come at her. And didn't try to be useful for once. Just sat there and let herself be somewhere that wasn't Red Hollow. He moved around the space with the ease of a man in the only place he'd ever been entirely comfortable, and she watched him without being obvious about it. He was different up here. Not relaxed exactly. She suspected he wasn't a man who was ever entirely relaxed, but less armored. The particular watchfulness he wore in town, the constant reading of the social environment, had settled into something quieter and more natural. You can have the loft, he said, without turning around. More private. The ladder's narrow, but it holds. I can manage a ladder. I know you can. She almost smiled. She was doing that more lately. Almost smiling. It felt like a muscle she'd forgotten how to use properly. The days that followed had a rhythm she hadn't expected. She had braced for the discomfort of proximity to a stranger, the awkwardness of shared space with someone she didn't fully know. What she found instead was that Crow was a man who had an apparently inexhaustible capacity for giving people room, physical room, conversational room, the room to be whatever they were without requiring commentary on it. He went out early each morning to check the trap lines he'd left running and to look at the passes. She understood this later, that he was also checking for movement on the lower trails, for any sign of riders coming up from the valley. He came back for mid-morning coffee and they would talk, or not talk, with equal ease. He was teaching her, without framing it as teaching, how to read the fire for heat economy, how to pack a wound with the specific moss that grew along the spring, how to tell from the sound of the wind which direction the weather was moving. And she taught him things without intending to. He watched her work with her sewing when she could manage it, the left hand improving slowly, the middle finger loosening as the swelling went down, and asked questions about the fabric and the structure of it, genuine questions, not polite ones. She found herself explaining the logic of construction, how a garment was an architecture of tension and support, and he listened with the same quality of attention he gave to everything, which was total. The rib was the hardest thing. She didn't admit how bad it was until the third day, when she tried to lift a water bucket and something shifted wrong, and she made a sound she couldn't entirely suppress. He was beside her in a moment, not hovering, just present, and she had to grip the cabin wall with her good hand and breathe through it. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine." "Evelyn." Not sharp, just direct. She sat down. He examined the rib with hands that were careful and impersonal. A man who had set his own injuries in the field and knew anatomy from necessity rather than schooling. He pressed along the bone, and she breathed and didn't make any more sounds she didn't intend to. "Fales bound this wrong," he said. "The break is stable, but it's been sitting at an angle. It's been knitting wrong. Can you fix it?" He looked at her. "Not fix, but I can rebind it in a way that'll let it heal straight. It'll hurt more than it does now for a few days." "Do it," she said. It hurt more than it did now. She held onto the edge of the bench and stared at the far wall of the cabin and breathed through it in the shallow then deep pattern he told her to use. And when it was done, she was sweating, and he handed her a tin cup of something warm without comment. "What is this?" she asked. "Willow bark tea. It's bitter." It was bitter. She drank it anyway. That night, lying in the loft with the fire sending warmth up through the floorboards, she felt the rib for the first time in weeks as something that might actually heal rather than simply hurt indefinitely. It was a small distinction, but it mattered enormously. Crow was below. She could hear him moving, the careful sounds of a man who was aware someone else was trying to sleep. She lay on her back in the dark and thought about Red Hollow, about the letters she'd written that had gone unanswered, about the specific shade of blue-black sky she'd stared at from the road. She thought about Cade Calloway's face close to hers, the awful calm of his voice. She had thought in the weeks afterward that the fear would define everything, that it would sit on top of every other feeling and be the primary experience of every day. What she found instead was that it was one feeling among several, and that several of the others were stronger. The anger was stronger. The particular cold determination that had kept her getting up every morning was stronger. She was still frightened. She was also, for the first time in weeks, somewhere that felt defensible. That was a new feeling, and it fit awkwardly, like a garment sized for someone slightly different, but she was keeping it. She slept better than she had since October. 12 days after they'd arrived at the cabin, Crow came back from his morning rounds moving faster than usual. She was at the table with her sewing, and she looked up before he'd said anything. "What?" she said. "Riders." He was already moving to the rifle by the door, checking it. 3 of them, coming up the south trail. They're not moving like lost travelers. She was on her feet. "How far?" "Hour. Maybe less." "They're pushing." She looked at him. He looked back. The cabin, which had been a refuge, was now very obviously a single room with one door. "You knew this might happen," she said. "I planned for it." He said it steadily, but she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, the rapid sorting of variables. "There are 2 things I need you to do. First, take this." He handed her a small revolver from the chest near the window. Older, a 5-shot, but solid. "Do you know how to use one?" "My father taught me," she said. "I haven't shot in 4 years. It comes back." He moved to the window and looked down the slope. "Second thing, there's a rock shelf above the cabin, northeast face, 40 yards up. You can see the approach from there, and they can't come at you from behind because the rock is sheer. If anything goes wrong down here, you go up there and you stay until you hear me call." "What's your call?" 3 short whistles. "And if I don't hear 3 short whistles?" He looked at her directly. "Then you keep going north. The Whitmore trading post is 8 miles. Tell them Silas Crow sent you. They'll help." She held the revolver at her side. It was heavier than she remembered from her father's, the metal cold against her palm. "You're not planning to run," she said. "No. You're going to meet them." "I'm going to meet them," he said, "before they reach the cabin. On terrain I know, and they don't." She understood what he was doing. In the wilderness he'd been describing to her over days of morning coffee, the advantage wasn't in numbers or weapons. It was in knowledge of the land. He knew every rock and fold of this slope. He knew where the ground was solid and where it gave way, where the sight lines opened and where they closed, where a man on foot could move faster than a man on horseback, and where the reverse was true. 3 men with rifles coming up an unfamiliar mountain trail, looking for a cabin, on ground they'd never stood on. They had guns and numbers. He had everything else. "Crow," she said. He was already pulling on his coat. "Be careful," she said. She almost said something else. Something about the 12 days in this cabin, about the willow bark tea, and the ridge she'd watched change color every evening as the light dropped. But she stopped herself because careful was enough. Careful was what she needed him to be. "Go up to the shelf," he said. "Now, while there's time. Don't wait to see how it starts." She went. The rock shelf was exactly where he'd described. A natural platform of granite, wind-scoured, sheltered at its back by the cliff face. From it she could see the entire south approach, the trail winding up through the timber below, the open snowfield between the tree line and the cabin. She saw them emerge from the trees 18 minutes later. 3 riders, moving in a spread formation the way men do when they expect resistance. Not bunched together, giving each other space, covering angles. They were armed. She could see rifles across saddles even at this distance. 2 she didn't recognize. The third, riding the black horse at the center, she recognized immediately. Cade Calloway had come himself. She hadn't expected that. She had thought he would send men and stay in Red Hollow behind the insulation of money and distance. But here he was, in person, on his black horse, coming up a mountain trail in November with his jaw set and the particular arrogance of a man who has decided to handle something himself. She gripped the revolver and watched. She didn't see Crow. That was the point. She couldn't see him, and that meant they couldn't see him either. He was in the terrain, part of it, which was where he was most dangerous. What happened next happened faster than she could fully track. The first thing was a sound. Not a gunshot, but a crack, sharp and structural, followed immediately by the sound of the snow on the slope to the left of the riders releasing. Not an avalanche, not large enough, but a controlled slide, a wall of snow and loose rock that came down across the trail behind the riders, with enough force and noise to send 2 of the horses into a violent sideways panic. The riders scattered. Cade's black horse held. He was a good horseman. She could see that even from here. But the 2 others were suddenly fighting their animals 30 yards apart, the horses refusing to settle. The riders consumed with not being thrown. Crow appeared from the right, from a fold in the rock she would not have identified as a hiding place. He was on foot and moving fast, and he had a rope. She understood it a second later, saw the other end of it tied to an anchor in the rock, saw that he'd pulled the trigger on the snowslide with it from cover. He came at the nearest unhorsed rider. One of the men had been thrown, was on his knees in the snow. And she lost the detail of what happened next in the distance and the movement, but the man did not get up again. She thought, not dead. Crow's hands, the way he moved, it wasn't killing. It was disabling. Precise and efficient, and without more force than necessary. The second rider got his horse under control and turned it toward Crow, raising his rifle, and Evelyn found herself on her feet on the rock shelf with the revolver up before she'd decided to stand, her father's voice in her memory saying, "Squeeze, don't pull, squeeze, don't pull." But she didn't fire, because Crow moved, a lateral step that took him behind a rock formation, and the rider's shot went into stone. Cade Calloway, on the far side of the snowfield, had finally gotten the black horse fully stopped. He was looking at the terrain around him with eyes that were trying to solve a problem his confidence hadn't prepared him for. The second rider turned his horse and rode down the trail. She registered this with a specific cold clarity. He was leaving. He had done the calculation of this unfamiliar mountain with a man in it who knew it completely, and he had decided the calculation didn't favor him, and he had left. That left Cade. Crow came out from behind the rock and stood in the open snowfield, rifle down at his side but in his hand, 40 yards between them. The disabled man somewhere behind Crow in the snow, not a factor anymore. The other rider gone down the mountain. Cade looked at Crow across that 40 yards of white. She couldn't hear what was said. The wind took the words and she was too far above. But she could read the geography of it. Cade's voice, his posture shifting from the animal authority of a man accustomed to being feared into something else, something she'd never seen on him before. And she understood with a jolt that she was watching Cade Calloway realize, possibly for the first time in his adult life, that he was in a situation he didn't control. He was alone on a mountain he didn't know. His hired men had failed or fled, and the man standing 40 yards away from him had just demonstrated with calm efficiency and zero wasted motion that he knew this mountain in a way that made Cade's rifle and his money and his name absolutely irrelevant. Crow said something else. She saw Cade's jaw tighten, then go rigid, then release. Cade turned his horse around and rode down the mountain. She sat back on the rock shelf. Her legs were shaking. She noticed this with detached interest, the body responding to something the mind had been too focused to feel during. She put the revolver down on the rock beside her and pressed her hands flat against the cold granite until the shaking stopped. 3 short whistles came up from below. She climbed back down to the cabin. Crow was inside when she got there, building up the fire. He had a cut along his forearm. Not deep, something from the rock or the rope, she couldn't tell, that he was ignoring with the practiced inattention of a man who has decided a wound is below the threshold requiring acknowledgement. "Sit down," she said. "Let me look at that." "It's fine. Sit. Down." He sat down. She cleaned the cut with the supplies from his kit. She'd learned where everything was over 12 days, and wrapped it with more efficiency than she'd thought she was capable of. Her hands were still slightly unsteady, and she didn't try to hide it. She just worked through the unsteady and did the job. "You let him go," she said while she worked. "Yes." "Why?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because a dead Calloway is a different kind of problem than a frightened one. A dead Calloway means every man on that ranch comes up this mountain with orders and authority. A frightened Calloway goes home and waits. And then? And then the territorial marshal, if Holt did what he said, should be in Red Hollow within the next 2 to 3 weeks. Should be, she said. Should be, he agreed. She tied off the bandage. She sat back and looked at him. He looked back at her, and there was something in his face that was different from his usual composure. Not broken, not soft, but open in a way he usually wasn't. The way a person looks when they've been in a situation that was genuinely uncertain and has come out the other side. "The man on the ground," she said. "Decker? Muir? Decker. He's going to have a bad headache and a twisted knee for a few weeks." He paused. "The knee was the terrain, not me. He landed wrong. But you left him down there." His horse was still nearby. "He can get himself down." She looked at the fire for a moment. The cabin was warming around them. Outside, the wind pressed at the windows, steady and indifferent. "He came himself," she said. "Cade. I didn't expect that." "He's more afraid than his father thinks he is," Crow said. "Men like him, when they've been afraid long enough, they do something stupid to stop feeling it. They come up mountains personally. They stand in front of dry goods stores for an hour. It's not rational. It's just fear acting like anger." She thought about that, about Cade's face across 40 yards of snow, the moment she'd seen something collapse behind his eyes. "What did you say to him?" she asked. At the end, Crow looked at the fire. "I told him the federal land office in Harrow has a registered deposition and a logged evidence record with his name on it, and that riding home was the last decision he'd make today that might still be the right one. And I told him that if he or anyone from his ranch came up this mountain again, I would not be standing in a snowfield with a rifle at my side." She was quiet for a moment, processing that. "Do you think he believed you?" she asked. "About the deposition, yes. About the rest?" He looked at her. "Yes, he believed that too." The fire crackled and settled. Somewhere outside, a wind gust moved through the pines with that particular sound. Not threatening, just present, just the mountain being itself. She had been cold on that rock shelf for an hour with a revolver in her hand, watching men come up a trail to find her, and she hadn't fired and she hadn't run, and she was sitting here now in this rough-built cabin with its uneven window frames and its stove running too hot on one side, and she examined the feeling carefully. She was all right. Not whole. Not finished. There were still things coming that she couldn't see yet, still a town below that had looked through her for 6 weeks, still a legal process that might or might not move the way it was supposed to move. She wasn't pretending any of that was resolved. But she was all right now, in this moment, and right now was all she had to manage. "Thank you," she said. She said it simply, without making it bigger than it was. He nodded once. He looked at the fire. "You're going to need to eat something," he said after a moment. "I know. There's still beans." "Of course there's still beans," she said. "There are always beans." He almost smiled. The corner of his mouth moved in a way she'd come to recognize as the closest he generally got. She'd learned to count it. She got up to find the pot. Outside, the mountain held them in its cold and indifferent silence, and it was enough. For now, it was enough. The days after Cade's retreat had a particular quality. Not peace, not exactly, but something like the stillness that follows a storm when you're not yet sure if there's more coming. Crow watched the trails. He didn't make a production of it, didn't announce that he was doing it, but Evelyn noticed the pattern. The way he angled his morning rounds to cover the southern approaches, the specific attention he gave to the lower tree line when he came back inside. She didn't comment on it. She understood it was necessary, and that saying so would only make him self-conscious about something he needed to do without self-consciousness. She was healing. That was the clearest change in those days, and it surprised her with its speed once the rib was bound correctly. The pain didn't disappear. It wasn't that simple. But it dropped from the constant foreground presence it had been for weeks into something more like background noise, a thing she was aware of without being dominated by it. She started sleeping through the night. She started eating properly, which the mountain air made easier, the cold burning appetite into her in a way that town life with its anxiety and humiliation had killed. Her left hand was coming back. The finger that had been wrenched still had a specific stiffness in the cold, and she suspected it would always have some degree of it. The joint had knit wrong in those weeks of inadequate rest, and the body's repairs are imperfect when you don't give them what they need. But she could hold a needle. She could work. She spent hours at the small table near the window with the natural light coming off the snow-covered slope outside, doing the alterations and repairs that Clara had given her before they'd left. The work she'd brought in her bag because she'd meant what she said about needing to use her hands or losing her mind. There was something about the rhythm of needlework that she had always found steadying, the repetition of it, the incremental progress visible in every completed seam. She could look at something she'd started that morning and see the work she'd done by afternoon. It was honest in a way that almost nothing else in her life had been honest recently. Crow noticed. He noticed the way she was different when she was working versus when she wasn't, the particular quality of her focus, the way her shoulders dropped half an inch. He was a man who had been observing living things in their habitat for 15 years, and he understood, without needing to articulate it, that work was to Evelyn Hartwell what the high country was to him, the place where she was most herself. He told her this one evening clumsily, in the roundabout way he had of saying things that mattered. He said, "You're good at that." She said, "I know." He said, "I mean, it's not just skill. When you're doing it, you look like you're exactly where you're supposed to be." She looked up from the fabric. He was on the other side of the stove, mending a piece of harness leather, and he was looking at her with the direct quality he had that she'd learned was not invasive, just honest. A man who looked at things he was interested in without pretending he wasn't looking. "You don't have to do that," she said. "Do what?" "Make me feel better about things." "I'm not trying to make you feel better," he said. "I'm just saying what I see." She held his look for a moment. Then she went back to the fabric. But she carried the words with her for the rest of the evening, turned them over in a part of her mind she kept quiet, let them sit there. On the 14th day, a rider came up from the valley. Not from the south, from the east, on a trail Crow had said was rarely used, coming in a way that suggested deliberate avoidance of the main approach. Crow saw him first from a high point on the slope and came back to the cabin moving fast, but not with the particular urgency of the previous situation. "Single rider," he said, coming slow, hands visible. She stood. "Who?" "Garrett." She hadn't expected that. She looked at Crow's face and saw something she couldn't immediately read. Not quite relief, not quite worry. Waiting. Garrett arrived at the cabin 20 minutes later. He was a big man, and the horse he'd ridden up was unhappy about it, and he dismounted with the stiffness of someone who had ridden farther than he was accustomed to in a single day. He looked at the cabin, and then at Crow, and then at Evelyn with an expression that held something complicated. Relief, and something underneath the relief that looked like it might be guilt. "They came," he said without preamble. Crow held the door open. "Come inside." Garrett sat at the table. He accepted coffee and wrapped his hands around the tin cup and didn't say anything for a moment, the way a man does when he's traveled a long way to say something, and now that he's arrived, he needs a moment to find the beginning of it. 4 days ago, he said finally, 2 federal marshals and a man from the territorial attorney's office came in on the Wednesday stage. He looked at Evelyn. "They had your deposition. They had Crow's corroboration. They had the registered evidence log from the Harrow Land Office. Evelyn sat down slowly. She was watching Garrett's face, reading it. They went to Pruitt first, Garrett continued. Showed him the deposition, showed him the federal authority papers. Pruitt. He stopped. Let out a breath. Pruitt gave them Cade, saying he gave up everything inside of 3 hours. The whole story. Who ordered what? Who knew what? Who was involved in covering it up? The room was very quiet. Evelyn started. 3 hours, Garrett said again. I don't think anyone expected that. I don't think Pruitt expected it of himself. But once those marshals were sitting in his office with federal papers and a registered deposition and the specific words Cade said to you that night, he shook his head. He'd been holding it for 6 weeks. You could see it on him. It was like a man who was tired of the wait. Crow leaned against the wall by the door and said nothing. Fales was next, Garrett said. They brought in the doctor. He didn't last as long as Pruitt did, honestly. He kept saying, I have a family. Apparently he said it 6 or 7 times, and at some point one of the marshals told him that was a reason to cooperate, not a reason to obstruct, and that changed the equation for him. He paused. He signed a full statement about the injuries. What he observed, what he knew, why he said nothing. He named Cade specifically in his documentation. Evelyn said nothing. She had her hands flat on the table in front of her, very still. They arrested Cade the following morning, Garrett said. Rode out to the ranch. Mitchell Calloway tried to... He had ranch hands there, and for a while it looked like it was going to go badly, and then Mitchell called them off. He looked into his coffee cup. Mitchell's not a stupid man. Whatever he is, he understood what a shooting confrontation with federal marshals meant, and he stood down. And Cade, Crow said. Cade went without a fight. Garrett said it with something that sounded almost like disappointment, as if he'd been expecting a different kind of ending to that particular man. He got on a horse between 2 marshals, and he went. I was watching from the feed store across the road. He didn't look at anyone. He just went. The fire popped in the stove, and Evelyn stood up and walked to the window. She stood there looking out at the slope, the snow, the line of pines below. Crow watched her back. He couldn't see her face. Decker and Muir? He asked Garrett, keeping his voice level. Decker's in federal custody. He came down from the mountain on his own the day after. Garrett glanced at Evelyn, not sure how much she knew. After. He had a bad knee, and he gave himself up at the federal office before he'd even cleaned up, which tells you something about what that mountain did for his sense of proportion. He cleared his throat. Muir is the interesting one. He apparently went directly to Garrett's, to my place, 2 days after everything started and asked to make a statement, of his own accord. He'd been on that ranch 5 years, and I think he knew what was coming and decided to be on the right side of it before the choice was made for him. He identified Cade specifically, Crow said. Not a question. By name, in detail, with a timeline that matches your deposition point for point. Evelyn turned from the window. Her face was controlled in the way it was when she was managing something big. Not blank, just compressed. Everything present, but held. What happens to Pruitt? She asked. Garrett looked at her. The marshals weren't specific. Cooperation is a factor. He'll likely lose the badge at minimum. There's talk of obstruction charges, but whether they pursue that... He spread his hands. I don't know. And fails. Same situation. He cooperated fully once he started. Whether that's enough... He shook his head again. She nodded slowly. She came back to the table and sat down and picked up her coffee. Her hands were steady. Crow noticed this. Mitchell Calloway, he said. This was the one Garrett had been working toward. Crow could see it in the way the older man shifted in his chair, the way he set down his cup. The attorney's office has been into the land records, Garrett said. The accounts. The notes Mitchell holds against half the businesses in Red Hollow. He paused. There are questions about how some of that land was originally acquired. Federal land questions. Parcels that should have gone to Homestead claim that ended up in Calloway hands through processes that don't fully hold up to examination. Crow went still. That's not just Cade's problem, Evelyn said quietly. No, Garrett said. That's the whole family's problem. That's the empire. He said the last word without drama, just factually, and it landed with a specific weight. I don't know how far it goes. I don't think anyone knows yet. But the attorney's investigator told me personally he was staying at my place. He talked more than he probably should have. He said this looks like it's been a 40-year project. Mitchell building a position in this valley on land he didn't always come by cleanly. The room held that for a moment. So Cade's arrest, Evelyn said slowly, opened something bigger. Your deposition, Crow said. He looked at her. Your deposition and the registered complaint and the evidence record, that's what opened it. Cade's arrest followed from that. She looked at him. There was something in her face he couldn't entirely interpret. Not disbelief, not dismissal, but a careful quality, the face of someone who has been told good news before and has learned not to absorb it too fast. It's not over, she said. Legal things take time. Yes, he said. And Mitchell will fight it. He will. And some of it might not stick. Some of it might not stick, he said honestly. But Cade is in federal custody. Pruitt and Fales have given statements that are on official record. Decker and Muir have corroborated your account. None of that disappears now. She held his eyes for a moment. Then she exhaled, long and slow, the way she had on the first morning of the ride out of Red Hollow, the breath of someone setting down weight they've been carrying for a long time. Garrett stayed the night. He wasn't going to ride back down in the dark, and Crow wouldn't have suggested it. They ate together. Evelyn had taken over most of the cooking in the cabin by the second week, having determined that Crow's approach to food was functional but depressing, and the atmosphere at the table was different from what it had been in Red Hollow. There wasn't the same pressure of things unsaid. Garrett talked about the town, not the investigation, the ordinary things, how Clara Statch had reportedly told Pruitt to his face before the marshals even arrived that she'd known what he was doing and that she was ashamed she hadn't said something sooner. How Tom Hess had gone to the federal attorney's office voluntarily to give a statement about what he'd seen that night on the road. Not just Evelyn's injuries, but the 3 pairs of boots that had walked past before him, the way the community had collectively abdicated. How the Reverend had given a sermon the following Sunday that was, from all accounts, the most uncomfortable 90 minutes that congregation had ever sat through. People are reckoning with it, Garrett said. They should have reckoned with it in October, Evelyn said. No heat in it, just a fact. Yes, Garrett said. They should have. Nobody tried to make that better than it was. After dinner, after Garrett had gone to sleep in the loft, Evelyn had moved her things down to the main room for the night without making it a discussion. Crow and Evelyn sat by the stove in the low light, and the silence between them had the particular quality it had developed over 2 weeks. Comfortable, but not complacent. The kind of silence between people who have been through something together and no longer need to fill space with words to prove they're at ease. I need to go back, she said. I know. Not to stay. But for the legal proceedings, the testimony, they'll need me in person eventually. The marshals will send word through Garrett when they need you, Crow said. We'll know before you have to go. She looked at the fire. The stove was running hot on the left side again. It always did, a flaw in the draft that he'd been meaning to correct for 3 years and hadn't. She'd stopped commenting on it. She'd started angling her chair slightly right to account for it. When I go back, she said carefully, and do what needs doing. The testimony, the formal procedures, I don't know what comes after that. He was quiet. I don't mean... She stopped. I mean practically. I don't have money to relocate. If things are different there now, maybe Clara would have work. Or maybe I go somewhere else entirely. She was talking through it, not asking him to solve it. He could hear the difference. I just don't know yet what the shape of the next thing is. That's fair, he said. You don't have to know yet. She glanced at him. You're good at that. What? Not pushing, not filling in the blank with what you think I should do. He looked at the fire. I spent too many years watching men who thought they knew better than the terrain tell me how to navigate it, he said. It didn't work out well for them. She turned that over for a moment. You're comparing me to terrain. I'm comparing... He stopped. That came out wrong. No, I understand what you mean. She almost smiled. I think. He looked at her then, not the tracking and assessment look he used when he was reading a situation, but the other kind, the one that was harder to categorize. She held it for a moment longer than she might have a month ago. I want to say something, she said. and I want you to let me say it without deflecting it." He waited. "You came to Red Hollow to sell pelts," she said. "That was the whole plan. You had no reason to notice me, no reason to stay, no reason to ride to Harrow and back in November snow, and absolutely no reason to be standing in a snowfield on this mountain with a rifle at your side making sure a man with money and grudge went home instead of, She stopped. Her jaw tightened and released. "I know I've said thank you before. I'm saying it again, differently. What you did wasn't something you owed me. You did it because you decided to." He was quiet for a long moment. "You would have found another way," he said finally. "Maybe," she said, "but that's not the point." "I know it's not the point." He exhaled through his nose. "I'm bad at receiving this kind of thing." "I know you are." He looked at the fire. She watched the side of his face, the scar along his jaw, the lines weather had put into skin that had been outdoors for most of his adult life, the specific quality of stillness he had that was not the stillness of a man with nothing going on inside, but the stillness of a man who had learned to hold things quietly. "You didn't break," he said. 6 weeks in that town, alone, in pain, with everyone looking through you. You didn't break. That's not something I gave you." He glanced at her. "That was already there." She looked at him for a long moment. "All right," she said. "We're both bad at this." Apparently. Outside, the wind came up the slope in a long, sustained gust that shook the window in its uneven frame. The stove popped. The fire held. The message from the territorial attorney's office arrived 11 days later, carried up by a postal rider who looked profoundly unhappy about his assignment and left as fast as his horse could manage the downslope. The letter was formal, dense with legal language, but its meaning was legible. Evelyn Hartwell's testimony was required for the formal proceedings against Cade Calloway and the 2 ranch hands. Her deposition had been entered into the official record. A federal advocate had been assigned to represent her interests in the proceedings at no cost to her. She read it twice standing at the table. Then she set it down. Crow was watching her from across the room. He'd been watching her read, and he didn't pretend he hadn't. "They gave me an advocate," she said. Something in her voice was careful with it, the way you're careful with something that might break if you hold it wrong. "I saw that," he said. "I didn't expect that part." "Holt," Crow said. "When I was at the land office, he asked more questions than I expected. I think he understood what he was dealing with." He paused. "He did right." She nodded slowly. Her hand was still on the letter. 2 days later, they came down the mountain. The descent was easier than the ascent had been. Less snow on the upper pass. The horses rested and cooperative. The mule still deeply opinionated, but at least consistent in its opinions. They didn't talk much on the way down. The mountain didn't need commentary. Red Hollow looked different from the approach road. Or maybe it was the same and she was different. The false fronts were still false. The church steeple still leaned its 3 degrees east. The streets were still the streets she had navigated for 6 weeks in pain and silence. But the arrangement of it had changed in her mind. It wasn't a trap anymore, wasn't the closed system that had pressed in on her from all sides. It was just a place where things had happened and more things were about to happen, and then she would decide what came after that. The 2 federal marshals were still in town, stationed at Garrett's boarding house. One of them, a spare, graying man named Tolliver, met them on the road as they came in and introduced himself to Evelyn with a formality that she found unexpectedly almost moving. He spoke to her as a person with standing in a legal proceeding. He used phrases like your account and your testimony and your advocate with a matter-of-factness that assumed she had these things, that of course she had these things, which was such a different experience than every interaction she'd had in this town for 2 months that she had to look away for a moment. Tolliver gave her a summary of the proceedings. Cade was in territorial custody pending trial. Decker and Muir had both entered cooperative agreements. Fales's medical statement had been formalized and entered as evidence. The land record investigation was ongoing and was likely to result in separate federal charges against Mitchell Calloway on questions of land fraud that predated the assault by decades. "Mitchell," Evelyn said. "He hasn't been arrested yet," Tolliver said carefully. "The land investigation takes time, but the Calloway accounts have been frozen pending the audit. The notes he holds against businesses in this town are under review." He paused. The practical effect is that his ability to exercise influence in this community has been substantially curtailed. She thought about what that meant for Red Hollow, what it meant for Pruitt, for Fales, for Tom Hess and Clara Statch, and the Hendersons, and the Reverend and all the others who had calibrated their behavior around the Callaway gravity for so long that it had stopped feeling like a choice. "What about Pruitt?" she asked. "Sheriff Pruitt has been suspended pending a formal review of his conduct," Tolliver said. "His cooperation has been noted. The outcome of the review will depend on factors I can't predict." He met her eyes. "I want to be honest with you, Miss Hartwell. Cooperation carries weight in these proceedings. Some of the people who failed you will face consequences that are less severe than you might feel they deserve. That's how this works. It's imperfect." "I know," she said. He looked slightly surprised that she hadn't argued. "I've known it was imperfect since October," she said. "I'd rather have imperfect than nothing." He nodded once. "Your advocate will be here Thursday. There will be a preliminary meeting to prepare your formal testimony." She thanked him. He walked back toward the boarding house with the measured stride of a man who had more work to do. Crow was standing a few feet away, holding the horses. He'd let her have the conversation without hovering. She walked back to him and took the roan's reins. "Fales," she said. "I want to talk to Fales." He looked at her. "Today?" "Not yet, but before the formal proceedings." She looked at the doctor's office at the far end of the street. "Not to forgive him. I need you to understand that's not what this is." She paused. "I want him to look at me. I want to be standing in front of him when he understands what his choices actually cost." "All right," Crow said. "You don't think it's a good idea." "I didn't say that. You have a specific quality of silence that means you're not sure something is a good idea." He considered this. "I have several qualities of silence. This is a particular one." He looked at the doctor's office, then back at her. "I think you should do what you need to do," he said. "I'm not here to tell you what that is." She held his eyes for a moment. Then she turned and looked at Red Hollow, the street, the buildings, the people moving about their Wednesday business who glanced at her, and some of them didn't look away this time. Some of them held her gaze with the uncomfortable directness of people who have recently been forced to look at themselves. Tom Hess was outside the feed store. He saw her. He didn't cross to the other side of the street. He stood where he was and gave her a slow, formal nod. Not the easy greeting of old acquaintance, not absolution, just an acknowledgement. She returned it with the same gravity. It wasn't forgiveness. It wasn't the restoration of anything that had been broken. It was something more basic and more durable, the simple fact of being seen. She had always been here. She had always been exactly who she was. It had taken federal marshals and a man from the mountains and the particular kind of stubbornness that her father used to call her worst quality and her best one to make the town stop pretending otherwise. The false-fronted building stood in the afternoon light. The steeple leaned its 3 degrees east. She was still here. The meeting with Fales happened on a Friday morning, 4 days after they came down from the mountain. Evelyn went alone. Crow had offered to come and she had declined. Not because she didn't want him there, but because this was something she needed to do in her own name, with her own voice, without the presence of someone else making it easier. She had been making things easier for herself in the wrong ways for too long. Not speaking, not pushing, not demanding to be heard. She was done with that. Fales's office was at the end of the main street, a narrow clapboard building with a hand-lettered sign that needed repainting. She'd been inside it once before, on the worst night of her life, sitting in a chair while a man with precise hands examined her injuries and then packed his bag and said, "I have a family," as if that explained everything. She knocked. He answered. He looked worse than she remembered. The weeks since October had done something to him. Not aged him exactly, but hollowed him out, the way anxiety hollows people when they can't sleep it off. His eyes went to her face immediately, and she watched him work to hold her gaze and not look away, which she could see cost him something. She came inside. She didn't sit down. "Miss Hartwell," he said. "Dr. Fales?" She let the silence sit for a moment. She had thought about what she wanted to say and had decided she wasn't going to prepare a speech, because prepared speeches were a way of staying at a safe distance from something, and she didn't want that distance. "I'm not here to threaten you or to tell you what's coming legally. Your attorney handles that." He nodded. His hands were at his sides, very still. "I want you to understand something," she said. "That night, You knew. You examined me, and you knew exactly what had been done and who had done it. You knew the level of injury. You knew I was in that room alone and frightened, and that what I was asking for was basic. She kept her voice even, not cold, even. And you made a choice. You made it quickly, which tells me you'd already decided before you walked in the door. He opened his mouth. She held up one hand. I'm not finished. He closed his mouth. The rib healed wrong because you bound it wrong, she said. Whether that was deliberate or just careless, I don't know. A man in the mountains with no medical schooling fixed it better in 20 minutes than you did in your own office with your own tools. She paused. I'm telling you that not to be cruel. I'm telling you because I want you to understand the full shape of what you didn't do. Fales looked at her. His jaw moved once, the way a jaw moves when someone is holding back something that wants to come out. You said you had a family, she said. I've thought about that a lot. I understand what it means. I understand the fear behind it. But here's what I want you to understand. I was somebody's family too, once. And what you did, what all of you did, is you decided that your fear mattered and mine didn't. That your family's safety was worth protecting and I wasn't worth the same consideration. The room was very quiet. Your statement to the marshals, she said, your full cooperation. I know about that. It matters to the case and I won't pretend it doesn't. She looked at him steadily. But it doesn't change what happened in this room on October 14th. And I need you to know that I know the difference between those two things. Fales's face did something complicated. The professional composure he'd worn last time, the careful avoidance, the bag-packing efficiency, was gone. What was underneath it was less composed and more human. His eyes were wet and he blinked it back with the determination of a man who felt he had forfeited the right to visible emotion. I'm sorry, he said. It came out rough. Not smooth, not the polished apology of a man who'd rehearsed it, just two words that sounded like they'd been sitting in him for weeks under pressure. She looked at him for a long moment. I know, she said. She left. Outside, the air was cold and clear, and she stood on the boardwalk for a moment and let herself feel the full weight of it, not the resolution she'd expected, which was something clean and definitive, but something messier and more real. She wasn't lighter. She wasn't heavier. She was just present. Here. Still here. She walked back up the street. Crow was outside Garrett's talking to Marshal Tolliver. He saw her coming and read her face in the way he read faces. Not intrusively, just accurately. And said nothing until Tolliver had excused himself. All right? He asked. Yes, she said. And then, not exactly, but yes. He nodded. He understood the distinction. The formal testimony happened the following Tuesday. The federal advocate, a woman named Birch, which surprised Evelyn and then embarrassed her that it surprised her, walked her through the process with a thoroughness that was also somehow kind. Birch had a way of asking questions that made room for the full answer, not just the legally useful part. She didn't rush Evelyn through the emotional texture of things. She understood that the emotional texture was part of the evidence, that the specific quality of Cade's voice and the specific geometry of the sheriff's avoidance were facts, as much as dates and times were facts. Evelyn sat in the formal room with the territorial seal on the wall and gave her account for 2.5 hours. She was precise. She didn't embellish, and she didn't minimize. When her voice tightened on certain parts, she stopped and breathed and continued. She did not apologize for the pauses. Birch told her afterward that it was one of the clearest testimonies she'd received in 11 years of advocacy work. Evelyn accepted the compliment without deflecting it, which was something she'd been practicing. Cade's trial took place 3 months later in the territorial capital, which was far enough from Red Hollow that Mitchell Calloway's influence couldn't reach the jury pool. Evelyn traveled there with Birch and gave her testimony in a formal courtroom in front of a judge who wore an expression of permanent skepticism and applied it equally to everyone, which was more than she'd hoped for. Decker testified. Muir testified. Fales's written statement was read into the record. The bootprint sketches, Crow's careful field drawings, were entered as evidence and explained by a surveyor who confirmed the measurements were consistent with Decker's recorded boot size. Cade sat at the defense table through all of it. Evelyn looked at him once during her testimony, deliberately, and found something she hadn't expected. He looked smaller than he had in her memory. Not physically. He was the same wide-shouldered man on the same black horse in her mind, but the room had deflated something in him, the specific something that had always been inflated by the deference of everyone around him. Without the deference, without the particular gravity of wealth and fear that structured Red Hollow, he was just a man sitting in a chair listening to a woman describe what he'd done. He was convicted on the primary charge of assault with intent to cause grievous bodily harm. The sentence was 8 years in the territorial penitentiary. She was standing outside the courthouse when the verdict came through the door with Birch. The sky over the territorial capital was the particular flat gray of late winter, clouds moving fast from the northwest, the smell of snow somewhere in the upper air. 8 years. She turned the number over in her mind. It wasn't enough. Some part of her knew that and accepted it, the same way she'd accepted Tolliver's warning about imperfect outcomes. 8 years was what the law gave her. It was not the full accounting for a night in October and 6 weeks of being invisible in a town that should have helped her. Nothing was that accounting. No number of years behind bars and no amount of legal language and no series of formal proceedings would hand her back the rib that healed wrong or the finger that would stiffen every cold morning for the rest of her life. But Cade Calloway was going to prison, and his father's land empire was dissolving under a federal audit. And Pruitt had lost his badge, and Fales had lost something harder to name, some essential confidence in himself that she suspected he would be rebuilding for years. And she was standing outside a courthouse in the territorial capital, upright, clear-eyed, with her advocate beside her and the verdict she'd written 3 letters and 1 formal deposition and endured 1 mountain winter to get. It was not nothing. It was the opposite of nothing. "Are you all right?" Birch asked. "Yes," she said. And this time it was simple. She wrote to Crow that evening from the inn where she and Birch were staying. She told him the verdict. She told him the sentence. She told him she was coming back north in a week when the follow-up proceedings were completed. She didn't tell him all the things she'd been thinking about on the road down and the road back and in the quiet of the cabin and in the slow mornings of the boarding house. Some things needed to be said in person, in the actual presence of someone, where you couldn't revise and you couldn't unsend. He was waiting at Garrett's when she got back. Not waiting in the sense of standing at the door looking out. Waiting in the sense that he was there, doing something practical with a piece of harness leather at the table in the sitting room, present in the building where she'd said she was coming. She sat down across from him. 8 years, he said. 8 years, she confirmed. He nodded. He looked at the harness leather and then set it down and looked at her instead. "Mitchell," she said. "The federal audit came back last week," he said. "Garrett got word through Tolliver. 14 parcels acquired through fraudulent homestead claims going back to 1861. The Calloway land holdings are being partially seized. Mitchell has been charged with federal land fraud." He paused. "He'll fight it. He has lawyers and he has time and he's 64 years old, so some of it may outlast him. But the ranch as it was, the way that family sat on this valley for 40 years, that's done." She thought about the feed store and the livery stable and the notes Mitchell held against half the town, the invisible architecture of obligation and fear that had made Red Hollow into a place where a woman could be left in a road. All of it built on land that wasn't cleanly his, all of it requiring the silence of everyone around it to keep standing. "Pruitt," she said, "I heard he left town." 2 weeks ago. Went to stay with a sister somewhere east. I don't think he's coming back." She nodded slowly. Outside the window, the afternoon was moving toward dusk, the sky over the ridge going orange and then deep blue in the way it did this time of year, color fading fast. "I went back to see Clara yesterday," she said, "before I came here." He waited. "She offered me my room back, work at the store." She looked at the table between them. She was different with me, attentive in a way she wasn't before. She kept checking if I needed things. "Guilt," Crow said. "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. "I don't know if I want it, the room, the work, being in that town with all of it, all the people who know what happened and know what they didn't do. I'd walk into the feed store, and Tom Hess would give me that nod, and I'd have to decide every single day whether I was going to carry the weight of their discomfort or let them off the hook." She shook her head. "That's exhausting." "It is," he said. She looked up at him. "You're not going to tell me what to do." "No." "But you have a thought." He was quiet for a moment. He had several thoughts, some of which were relevant to the practical question she was describing, and some of which were relevant to something else entirely. And he was having the internal argument he'd been having with increasing difficulty for the better part of 3 months. "I've been thinking about the cabin," he said carefully. She held his gaze. "I've been going up there for 4 years and coming back down for supplies and going back up," he said. It's worked. It's been sufficient." He stopped. He was not a man who talked around things as a rule, but this particular thing had sharp edges he was navigating. "It's been sufficient as long as I wasn't thinking about whether it could be something else." "And now you're thinking about whether it could be something else," she said. "Yes." The sitting room was quiet around them. The fire in the boarding house hearth made its small sounds. Somewhere deeper in the building, May Garrett was in the kitchen, and the smell of something cooking moved through the air. "I'm not asking you to decide anything right now," he said. "I know there's a process you're in the middle of. The legal proceedings aren't fully closed. You have things to figure out about what you want. I understand that." "But," she said, "but I'm telling you that when you figure it out, when you know what you want the shape of the next thing to be, I'd like to be part of that conversation, whatever it turns out to mean." She looked at him for a long moment. She looked at the scar along his jaw and the lines in his face and the specific quality of steadiness in his eyes that had been the first thing she'd noticed about him and was still the thing that struck her most. Not because it was rare in people, but because in him it was real. Not a performance of calm, but the actual thing, earned through years of being alone in country that didn't forgive errors. "You came to Red Hollow to sell pelts," she said. "I did," he said, "and instead you got 3 months of complicated problems, and a woman who argued with you constantly, and a mountain confrontation, and extensive legal proceedings." "Yes." "And you're still here." "I'm still here," he said. He said it simply, without elaboration, which was the only way it meant what it meant. She looked at her hands on the table. The left one, the finger that would always have some stiffness in it, the small, permanent record of a night in October. She had stopped trying to hide the stiffness. It was a part of how her hand worked now. "I don't know what I want yet," she said honestly. "I need time to want things without fear in front of them. I've been wanting things through fear for so long, I'm not sure I remember what it feels like to just want something because it's good." "That's a fair thing to say," he said. "But," she looked up, "I'm not going to Clara's room, and I'm not going somewhere entirely new where I don't know anyone." She held his eyes. "I want to go back to the cabin, for a while, and I want to figure out what comes after that from somewhere that already feels like something." He was quiet for a moment. "The draft on the left side of the stove," he said, "is still wrong, yes. I've been meaning to fix it." "You've been meaning to fix it for 4 years. I'll fix it before winter." She almost smiled. She went past almost this time, an actual smile, small and unguarded, the kind that doesn't perform anything. He saw it, and something in him settled into a different position, like a thing that had been braced against a load and was finally permitted to stand straight. There are stories that end with justice, clean and complete, and those stories are satisfying in the way of things that have been neatly resolved. This was not entirely that story. Cade Calloway was in prison, but he was also a man who had spent 28 years being told that the world arranged itself according to his preferences, and 8 years might not fully undo that. Mitchell Calloway's lawyers were good, and the federal audit would take time, and some of those fraudulent parcels might survive the challenge. Pruitt was gone, but what he'd been was still written into the architecture of a town that had spent years building itself around the assumption that certain people's problems were worth attention and others weren't. The damage that had been done to Evelyn Hartwell in a road on October 14th was permanent in certain ways, and no verdict changed that. Her body held the record. The winter she'd spent in pain, the weeks of being invisible, the specific quality of those 11 minutes on the ground, those things were hers to carry. That was the truth of it. But here's what was also true. She had not broken. She had written letters that went unanswered and written more letters. She had walked into the sheriff's office on a cracked rib and stated what had happened in plain language and walked out when it became clear he wasn't going to act, and then she had stayed. She had accepted help from a stranger who arrived without warning from the mountains, and accepting help when you need it is harder than people give it credit for, especially when you've been let down enough times that trust feels like something you can't afford. She had gone up a mountain and come down again. She had sat in a formal courtroom and looked at the man who had hurt her and told the truth calmly and completely for 2.5 hours. The woman who had been left in that road was not the same woman who was sitting in Garrett's boarding house on a winter evening saying, "I want to go back to the cabin." Not because the first woman was lesser, she had always had this in her, but because something that was already there had been pulled to the surface by the weight of everything that had tried to keep it under. That was the part that mattered. Not the verdict, not the 8 years, not the federal audit and the fallen empire, and the sheriff who fled to his sister's house. Those things were consequences, and consequences are important, but they're not the story. The story was a woman who kept getting up in the morning when getting up was the whole plan and there was nothing else to offer. The story was a man who came to sell pelts and made a decision in an alley over a button with a double C stamp because some things make a noise in your head you can't stop. The story was two people, both imperfect, both carrying the particular awkwardness of people who have been alone long enough that proximity to someone else requires adjustment, who had found, in a one-room cabin with an uneven door and a stove that ran hot on the left side, that some things are worth adjusting for. They rode north 3 days later. The morning was cold and clear in the way of early winter, the kind of day where the air has a quality that makes everything look slightly more real than usual. The color in the rocks, the darkness of the pines against the snow, the sky a shade of blue that was nothing like October's sky over a road in Red Hollow. Nothing like it at all. The cabin was cold when they arrived, the fire long dead, the space holding the smell of pine and ash and empty time. Crow went to the stove and she heard him working at the draft on the left side. Actually working at it, tools out, the specific sounds of a man fixing something he'd been putting off for 4 years. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at the space, the small table by the window, the loft, the uneven window frames and the door that needed upward pressure to latch. She walked inside and set down her bags. Outside, the mountain held its winter silence, wind and timber, and the distant sound of the spring running somewhere in the cold, unchanged and indifferent and completely sufficient. She had learned to live inside that silence and to find in it not the absence of things, but the presence of something harder to name. The sense that the world was large and you were small in it, and that smallness was not the same as insignificance. She had been dismissed as powerless once by a man who confused silence for weakness and a town's complicity for truth. She did not intend to make that dismissal easy for anyone again. The stove clicked and then caught, the first small sounds of heat beginning to move through the iron. "Fixed it," he said. She looked over at him. He was still crouched by the stove, looking at the draft with the focused satisfaction of a man who has corrected something that was wrong for too long. "We'll see," she said. He looked up. She was already unpacking her sewing case, moving to the table by the window where the light was best, the left hand with its stiff finger finding the familiar weight of the needle case and the thread and all the small tools of work that was honest and hers. The stove ran even on both sides that evening. Outside, the first snow of the season came down soft and unhurried over the mountain, covering everything equally, the way nature covers things, without judgment, without memory, without the particular cruelty of people who choose to look away. Just white and silence and the long patience of high country that has been here longer than anyone's problems and will be here long after they're resolved. Inside, the fire held.
Let's get physical.
Mystical, magical.
Moonbeam ice cream.
Staring at your butt cheeks.
Does it feel so mystical, magical?
I play Finboy Feet. James, let me see it. No. Who's the hottest league chamber, bro? Dunkmaster Darius. Self-cessed Benson Boone getting James knocked up. What the fuck? Think, white boy, think. I'm thinking. I'm thinking so hard right now.
What the fuck?
I don't know. I'm moving past it.
Play Peak.
We could play Peak. I'd rather just play
We
Lethal at
would
that
beat
point
it,
if we're gonna do
just
friends.
us.
If we're gonna do friend swap, we might as well just play Lethal. Bye. I'm gonna go get dinner and think about your meat. Bye. Bye, Merlin. Thank you for the follow again. Brembo doesn't like the femboys, but he likes the rugged looking papas. So true. Merlin Goater.
Do a Slay the Spy run.
No. Come on, Ben. Let's play some Lethal. 2-man Lethal.
2-man lethal just does not sound fun.
I want to play with IRLs. Can you let go Jurassic World? That's not even a thing, is it? Oh wait, it is a thing. Never mind. I was thinking like the Ark Builder game, but I know Ben is getting heated up looking at the Vex splash art. What the hell?
Rip.
All right, bro. We could play. We can play